Very nice to see you over there, and thanks for inviting me.
It's always nice to talk to you, Wouter, because I think you are exceptional in sort of picking up issues and commenting on really what's going on in the aviation world. So I think it's always great talking. It's always great talking to you, and I learn a lot. So that's
same here. I like to apply the knowledge that we gain as academics to the real world, and so I try to apply things. So much has been written about low cost, isn't it? But not many people seem to link the research that we've done to what's going on. And indeed, it's a very good idea of you to link Spirit and what's going on there. In the US and Europe and Asia, 3 different markets, so in a different pace. So, and I like to watch or have a look at the United States, because it's always a little bit the canary in the coal mine. What's happening there happens in Europe 10, 15 years later, and then 10, 15 years later it happens in Asia.
Consolidation.
Oh, I see. So
that would be your prediction. So maybe what we should start is explaining what happened. And I think the major thing that happened is that in a short period of time, oil prices doubled. And now the question is, why does it matter for aviation? Because I'm not so sure actually everyone is so aware about, how important are oil prices for airlines. So what would you say?
Right, it all starts there, of course. 1/3 of the operating cost of an airline is linked to aviation fuel. But of course, there's a difference between the low-cost carriers, who spend about 40% of their average operating cost on fuel, while the full-service carriers, because they have a higher cost base, spend on average 25%. So an impact of a rise or a decrease in oil price immediately has a bigger impact on low-cost carriers than it has on full-service carriers.
Right. So I think this is so important, always to get the kind of orders of magnitude right. And here we are, as you said, talking about a large share of the cost of airlines, and especially also low-cost carriers. So maybe it's not a big surprise that the low-cost carrier has been maybe the first in this crisis that has gone bankrupt. I think it's the only one until now, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, there are more things happening there as well, isn't it? They were already Spirit. You talk about Spirit, I guess. They already were in dire straits already years before. They've gone through a few bankruptcy processes. So the cost base was not bad, but the revenue base was too low. And it's still a rather small carrier if you look at the US context. And they didn't have the economies of scale or density to cope with it. And in the United States, you have 4 large airlines, 3 full-service carriers. You have American, Delta, United Airlines. But you also have Southwest Airlines, which used to be a low-cost carrier, but which moved more and more towards the hybrid type of airlines. So, and these 4 airlines, they cater for about 75% of all the domestic seats. And then the remaining 25% is just scattered over a bunch of airlines, low cost and leisure airlines and all of that. And Spirit was basically too small to compete on.
Do you know
on
the market share of Spirit in terms of passengers carried?
I don't know it by heart, but it's only a few percent, and that's definitely not large enough. And there you cannot really make the link with Ryanair, because Ryanair has a significantly higher market share in Europe, or AirAsia, or other low-cost carriers in Asia. But Spirit was rather small, and they didn't manage to get there. And the high fuel prices were not the reason, but were the last drop in the bucket before everything finished.
Right. And I think there's another very important difference between US carriers and European carriers when it comes to protecting against high fuel prices. So obviously I'm talking about fuel hedging.
Yeah, European carriers have the habit of hedging, typically between 65 and 90%. Now, Wizz Air is hedged for about 60-65%. It's a low-cost carrier, ultra low-cost carrier in Europe. Ryanair is about 90% and plus. And they have this habit, and the large carriers like Lufthansa Group, AirFrance-KLM Group, and IG Group, they're around 70-75% hedged. But of course, most of these hedges are on oil prices. And we do see that the oil prices nearly doubled, about $65 to $110 per barrel. But what we do see is the jet fuel has increased even more. So
Really?
the jet fuel crack is the difference between the crude oil price and the jet fuel price that more than doubled. So you can do hedging, that's fine, but most of the hedges are on oil, and the jet fuel price increased even more. So that's what you can hedge whatever you want, but still, if the crack spread is increasing, then your cost increases anyway.
But of course, I mean, this makes a big difference if you're using fuel hedging or not. And I think this is not only true for low-cost carrier, when we are talking about the difference between US carriers and European carriers, also for full-service carriers, the same, right? I think in the US, basically no fuel hedging, right? I mean, they hedged in the past, but I think right now, these days, in the recent past, basically no hedging. Whereas, as you said, in Europe, that's pretty common practice.
Yeah, but one of the reasons, of course, in Europe, we already had a few traumas in Europe in the 70s and the 80s with fuel. We're pretty dependent on sources outside Europe. And the United States, they have their own fuel. Even Delta Airlines, they have their own refinery. But indeed, there's no habit of doing that. They seem to think that passengers will get the additional cost. They also do not sell as many tickets beforehand as European carriers tend to do. And the Middle Eastern carriers, they also don't hedge for obvious reasons. Of course, if the fuel price goes up, the owners, the state of most of these Middle Eastern airlines is the owner, they get more revenue. So Middle Eastern carriers do not tend to hedge as well. And I did some research, and Chinese carriers don't hedge as well. But what they do is they buy fuel from Sinopec, which is the national oil provider, and Sinopec actually hedges on their behalf, and they sell this jet fuel on a kind of average price. And in Asia, you have all kind of difference. You have airlines which are well hedged, you have airlines which are not well hedged, and so on. So it's very scattered in Asia. But European carriers generally tend to hedge significantly more than their peers in other continents.
So how do the airlines respond in terms of ticket prices? What happened to the ticket prices?
Right. The only way is up. It's very clear that these airlines see the cost base increase, either partially or fully, and they do react immediately. We saw in the United States, prices immediately increased significantly, between 25 and 35%. Airlines were charging certainly more for luggage because there the price elasticity seems to be a bit lower. In Europe, we see increases between 15 and 25%. And in Asia, it's even more because there the jet fuel price is even more expensive than it is in Europe or in the United States. So there you see huge increases on the number of routes. You even see cancellations on quite a number of routes because of the price increase, of the cost increase. Many airlines said, look, this route is not profitable anymore. Instead of increasing prices, they just canceled that route.
So are airlines just to make it very clear, are airlines to blame for the ticket pricing increases in the ticket price? Because, for instance, in Germany, I understand people are complaining a lot about gas prices for their cars. Everybody is very angry. And I guess that some people may also be angry with airlines increasing their ticket prices.
Yeah, I haven't heard much, but of course, if you look at the cost of an airline ticket in the holiday cost over the years, this has always decreased. You also see hotel prices increase, taxi, the visit of all kind of attractions. So the airline ticket price and the total holiday price is only minor. In the past, it was significantly more. But people always complain, of course, about price increases. They're quite sensitive to that. But what the airlines are doing, I think, is just normal market behavior. And what's also good, at least in Europe, that once you have bought a ticket, the airline cannot increase the price any further. So everyone who has bought their ticket already is pretty well protected. So you cannot increase your fuel surcharge retroactively. Some airlines were trying to do that. I've heard that Ethiopian Airlines is doing that. Some airlines in Asia were doing that. Sometimes they're allowed by local law, but in Europe, if you fly in Europe or out of Europe, you're not allowed to do that.
Right. And I mean, I think you said it also we talked about this in the very beginning. Oil or jet fuel is a very important part of their cost. And if there is a very drastic increase, I think somehow airlines have to survive, right? And they're usually not the most profitable. So the margins are not necessarily the highest. So I think I would say, keeping this in mind, that the increase in the ticket prices seem like, as you said, like market behavior as we would expect it to happen, and as we also actually want it to happen, right?
Yeah, the calculation is not so complicated, Achim. Now, if you take on average 30% of the cost is related to fuel. If that doubles, then your total operating cost, if all the other costs remain the same, just fuel doubles, then your cost increases about 30%. And if you do know that most airlines only have an operating margin, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and even the very, very lucrative ones like Emirates and Ryanair have 12, 13%, you very clearly see there's a big gap. And that gap can only be covered by an increase in revenue in the ticket prices. So the calculation is not so complicated. And if you cannot pass on these additional costs into higher revenue, you have to cancel your flight. Otherwise, there's no other way how to cut costs any further. So I think it's not so complicated.
That's right.
Evaluate the impact.
Yeah, but on the other hand, since we're talking about markets and we are both having economics like business background, so we understand that prices are determined by cost, but also by the demand, right? We are talking about the equilibrium prices. And I think the current situation as it is not necessarily one where we would expect that the demand is increasing, but rather that the demand would be lowered. And I understand that this is actually also something that happens. So that puts some downward, actually having a lower demand. So the demand does not only go down because maybe the prices are higher, but also because just overall the sentiment, the interest in traveling would be lower. And I think that could put some downward pressure on the prices. I was surprised, actually. I was recently booking a flight, and to be honest, it was really pretty cheap. It was off season, but the prices were really very, very good. I was surprised because I also looked at some other prices. Of course, this is all anecdotal evidence, but I also looked at some other in the recent past, so to say, at prices, and sometimes it just double. It seemed like the ticket price is twice as high. Then still there are some other, ticket price that doesn't seem to be responding so drastically to the changes in the oil price. And I do believe that this has something to do with people being sort of, at this point in time, also a little bit reluctant traveling.
Yeah, there was an article in the Financial Times yesterday which looked at about 50 city pairs in Europe, and they noticed indeed that some ticket prices are decreasing. Of course, airlines need bums on their seats, so if the demand is getting a bit sluggish, they are slashing prices for a number of seats, on the number of routes, on the number of timings. So it's indeed a fact that the demand in Europe specifically has decreased a little bit. We have the Gulf War. For many people, it's pretty close, because if I speak to my parents, who are well educated, they say, we don't go to Turkey, it's too close to Iran, or they don't want to go to Egypt or Morocco because they think it's too close. So many people are already a bit reluctant to travel because of that. There was lots of fuss, especially in Europe and in Asia as well, about potential shortage of airline fuel. And people think, oh my God, maybe I will not be able to depart or come back. So there's lots of uncertainty around it, and people don't like that. So people just wait to book. I think that's one of the phenomenons happening there.
And I think we started talking about Ryanair, and Ryanair is. I read a comment on your LinkedIn page, and I would recommend everyone to follow Wouter, because he's always posting very interesting and knowledgeable, insightful comments, pretty detailed comments actually about aviation market. So please, everyone, have a look at his LinkedIn page. And I think you commented also on Ryanair, and I think they stopped serving Berlin, but I don't think this has anything to do with the Gulf War, right?
No, it's a typical Ryanair negotiating tactic that they are pulling out their aircraft from a base if the aircraft has to pay too much to leave Berlin. If the airport taxes are getting too high, then they say, look, I'm going away and all of that. So they do that all the time, plug and play, and they can do that with their business model. And what's the fact is that their business model, especially the ultra low-cost carriers, they're very vulnerable to price increases, because when you talk about price elasticity, and it's a pity we don't have so much academic research about it, Achim. The latest figures we always find is the price elasticity for this type of leisure travel is minus 1.5, which means if the prices decrease 10%, the demand goes up 15% and vice versa. However, I do observe that there's a difference between the price elasticity from ultra low-cost carriers, which try to generate traffic by having very low fares, and the more traditional full service carriers where the price elasticity is probably not as harsh as the ones for the ultra low cost carriers. And what you do see, if you have a basic fare of like say 20 or 30 euro, and then you add on top of that additional airport taxes, you add on top of that additional government taxes, then your 20 euro maybe becomes 40 euro. And then the price elasticity starts to play and the demand decreases significantly. And that's exactly why Ryanair absolutely hates increased airport taxes, and they hate these government taxes, because it's the basic of the business model. They attract passengers with a low fare, and then they try to sell ancillary revenues, which has a different price elasticity, priority boarding, seating, choice, hand luggage, and all of that, in order to make up the final ticket price. So Berlin case you were referring to is typically something where they were against this type of airport taxes. They also threatened to leave Brussels South, Charleroi, because of the government tax. In Belgium, the tax goes up from 5 to 10 euro, which is still rather low in a European or a Western European context. And they threatened to take out 6 out of the 20 aircraft they have stationed there. So that's the Ryanair DNA, and that's the game they play. And that's their right. It's the market. But fuel prices, you start off your question, will impact the ultra low-cost carriers even more. Even if they are hedged in the short term, in the medium term, it will hit them more, because they have 40% of their operating cost is fuel. And if that suddenly doubles, then they have a huge impact on their operating cost.
You mentioned the estimates of price elasticities. I mean, I'm involved in a couple of projects, and my own experience, or my feeling is, also when I talk to others, is that it's not easy to estimate, and the estimation results are very much dependent on the design, on the estimation of the design, regression design, basically, and the results are very often quite sensitive with respect to some changes in, I don't know, you can think about all kinds of issues like fixed effects or any other like methodological issue. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I feel we shouldn't be too. It's good to have an understanding a little bit of the orders of magnitude, but these price elasticities, I think there are quite a few around, but they can vary quite substantially. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. It's just they really depend very much on the context, on the market context, and so on and so forth. So just because you said that, we need estimates of price elasticities, and I do believe that there are there are quite a few around, but they are not necessarily giving a very consistent picture.
Yeah. But what's the fact is that one of the features of an ultra low cost carrier is that they create a market. They do not only take passengers away from the full service carriers, they create a market by offering low fares. And you see that's what's happening in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, also in India now, that by offering low fares, people suddenly start to travel. Maybe they were traveling before by bus, by train, or they were not traveling at all. And suddenly they start to travel. The same in Europe. Of course, the secondary effect was that they were really competing with the full service carriers on price. So you do see that there's an increased connectivity, but there's also increased competition, lowering the prices of the full service carriers. But once again, they didn't kill the markets. They just created an additional market. And of course, if the market evolves a bit like the United States is happening, there you have a consolidation of a number of carriers. People seem to be addicted in the United States with these frequent flyer miles linked to their credit card and to their status and all of that. So people tend to fly a bit more premium because the average income is rising. And so all these things are happening that the low-cost carriers in the United States, the ultra-low-cost carriers, are put in a corner. In Europe, we do not see that phenomenon yet. You were referring to a LinkedIn post I did. I did not announce the end of the ultra-low-cost model, but I put some question marks behind the continued growth. If you see that Ryanair has ordered, I think, 200, 250 additional aircraft to be positioned in Europe over the next couple of years, my question is, will they be able to fill these aircraft with ultra low cost passengers? In Western Europe, I have a big question mark there. A number of reasons. One, people tend to move more and more toward a somewhat premium segment in Western Europe. Two, the price difference, the relative price difference between a fare on the ultra low cost carrier and a full service carrier is shrinking. Because the ultra low cost carrier, they have these airport fees, they have the government taxes on top of that. So in an absolute figure, the difference is not so much, especially if the full service carriers are also introducing this type of basic economy fare where you have to pay for your hand luggage as well. So you
Which
see
they
the fares
do, right? Yeah.
are coming closer to each other.
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, of course, if Ukraine opens up and a number of countries, there's plenty of market still there. And in
This
Asia,
is, I
and
think,
in
one of the
Europe.
reasons why the low-cost carriers, I think, is Ryanair the biggest European airline? I think it's the biggest. I think it's bigger. It's
If you
not
look at
bigger
number
than
of
the Lufthansa
passengers,
group or the
Yeah.
groups, but as if you take the individual airlines, you know, by their names in a sense, then I feel, if I'm my understanding is that Ryanair is the biggest, or at least the second largest airline in
No,
Europe.
it's the largest. It's the largest in the number of passengers. It's the largest in revenue passenger kilometer, but it's not the largest in turnover.
So I think this is, and that's for a reason. It's not only, it's because they, as you say, for instance, they go to airports that are almost not very highly utilized, and they make them, you know, the passenger numbers boom. And then this is also why actually airports are happy if they are chosen until they are maybe until the low-cost carriers leave, of course, because they say, you know, what I'm always telling my students, and they always open their eyes. They say, how come? They say, you know, as what the basically the low-cost carriers or Ryanair, Michael O'Leary says, is like we shouldn't be paying the airports. The airports should be paying us because, you know, what would the airport be without us? We bring them passengers, so they benefit from all the revenues from non-aeronautical services, and we want our share. So if anything, you should be paying us rather than we paying you. And it sounds to someone, I think, with not necessarily economic background or business background, sounds strange, but I don't think it's strange. It makes sense to a certain degree. Of course, there is a lot of room for negotiation here, but in principle, it's not a crazy idea.
But you also see that some full service carriers like Lufthansa, they have set up a successful low-cost competitor to Ryanair. It's more a low-fare competitor, like Eurowings, for instance, is the low-cost daughter from Lufthansa Group. You have Transavia, the one from AirFrance-KLM, and you have Vueling, the one from Iberia. You do see that they have set up a good ring of defense. Ryanair isn't making bread in Germany. You have the airport taxes, which are pretty high. You have the government taxes, which are pretty high. And you have Eurowings, which is basically flying from most of the German airports at low fares, where you can gain miles if you fly them and all of that. So Germany does work for Ryanair.
That's the competition,
Netherlands.
right? I think this is what
Yeah,
we
the
like.
Netherlands.
We have a
That's where
carrier, they have some model, others learn from that model, and then they start competing. And at the end, we, as the consumers or the travelers, benefit from this, right? So it's something that we should be appreciating, and I think many people will appreciate, but it's not necessarily so obvious. This is why we like competition. This is why we like those markets. And you can see that it works because, we can fly at a relatively low ticket, not high, but low ticket prices to lots of places. So that shows that these markets actually work. So that's a good lesson, I
If you
think.
go back to the United States, there all the main full-service carriers had a low-cost carrier as well. And after a while, they decided to just stop with it and integrate everything in one model. So in Europe, we still have that. And then for me, the question mark is, will this multi-brand strategy, which Air France-KLM and British Airways, Iberia and Lufthansa Group will that continue? Or will they start consolidating there as well? And what happens with their low-fare carriers? I don't dare to call them low-cost carriers because often their cost base is significantly above the Ryanair and the Wizz Air. But it's really helping as a ring of the event. So it would be very interesting to see in 10 to 15 years' time where we are with Europe. So maybe.
What do you think? I think the US market has been consolidating. It's quite a long time ago, and Europe. I don't see much consolidation in Europe. Or am I wrong?
I think you're wrong. Sorry for that. We see a big consolidation actually in Europe. We have three main carriers, Lufthansa Group, but you have quite some carriers under that. Recently, they purchased ITA, the Italian airline as well. So they are now the largest group. They have Brussels Airlines, of course, Lufthansa, Swiss, Austrian Airlines. They have Eurowings. And they're now competing to get TAP, the Portuguese carrier, which is up for sale. You have Air France-KLM Group. Recently, they purchased SAS in the north. Now they are trying to get TAP. And then you have the IAG Group, which consists of British Airways, Aer Lingus, Iberia, Vueling. So it is consolidating, and you still have a few ailing smaller carriers like the Bulgarian and the Tarom Romanian Airlines and all of that. You still have LOT and Finnair. So we see if that will continue to work. History in the United States shows it's rather complicated. So I think in a few years' time, you'll probably have three large airline groups left, full service carriers. You probably have Ryanair left, and then probably EasyJet either linked with Wizz Air or Wizz Air linked with Ryanair. So I think you will end up with 5-6 airlines in Europe, a bit similar as is happening in the United States. The question, of course, is we as Europeans, are we nationalistic? Do we still want our own airline? Or are we happy like the United States, you use the Pac-Man strategy and move to one single airline brand? That's for me question mark. I don't see the Dutch flying with Air France Netherlands. I don't see the Swiss flying with Lufthansa Swiss. So it might take probably another generation before the brands are gone. But you have Coca-Cola, you have Fanta, you have Sprite. It's all the same company, but in a way, they have different brands in a way. So I think that will be the direction.
So we should be keep talking about this in 10, 15 years, and then we can see how that develops. Thank you so much, Wouter. I think it was great. Thank you so much. I think it was a wonderful update about what's happening right now. I learned a lot, and thank you so much for your time.